This is the part of the show where we show you how to make money. That is always a good thing, and who better to guide us on this journey of capitalism than Liz from Remax Diamond Realty Guam. Hafa Happy New Year.
Hafa Happy New Year.
And thank you for bringing the dollar symbol and hopefully how we can collect that, hopefully more in our favor. Now, one thing that I want to know is, you know, everybody always says we have such a positive relationship, Guam's local community, we do with our friends in the military. Right. And more people, I've seen this over the years, just, you know, I mean, you get 19 and 20-year-olds who've been in the Navy or the Air Force for 2 years. They're living off base. It didn't used to be that way like in the 80s and 90s and the Guam I was growing up with. So if someone is thinking about renting a place or maybe selling their property to a military and their dependents, what are the differences between that and selling to the civilian market, and what should we know, especially if it's the first time we take on that transaction?
So if you're looking at, let's say you're selling a home, and you get an offer from a VA buyer, what normally happens is it's totally different from a regular loan type. So the offer, of course, is subject to an appraisal, which is pretty standard in all the home transactions, but there's a two-step process where the purchase is subject to an appraisal, but then once the appraisal comes in, that appraisal will still have to go to a VA officer where they can review the appraisal and say, okay, we've given you the notice of value. They've approved the notice of value, meaning they've either agreed with the appraisal value. So, for example, you're buying something for $480,000. So the appraisal came out at, let's say, $481,000. That appraisal is uploaded into the system, and then the VA office will review it. And if everything is in line, they will say, okay, we're good with the appraisal value and approve it. Then the transaction can move forward. However, if the notice of value is less than the appraisal value, let's say they dispute something or don't agree with the appraiser's valuation, then what stands to move forward is that notice of value from the VA office. So once that's in place, you can move forward. They're the deciding factor of the value. The Veterans Office decides what that value is. So the other thing to know also is normally the the VA buyer cannot pay for their closing costs. So that is stuff that usually the seller would bear. Now, so normally if you're a seller, you need to know a number of things. One, the escrow fees are covered by the seller. A VA buyer would sometimes ask for a credit of some sort. They may ask for a credit to cover part of their closing costs. Now, a VA buyer could have that covered by you as a seller, or they can incorporate that into their loan. So sometimes the seller says, no, I don't have room to give credit. Therefore, the buyer has to come up with it, you know, in terms of adding it into their loan or coming up with it out of pocket. So, and the other thing a seller would be responsible for is getting a pest inspection report. So appraisal, pest inspection, seller's closing costs. A VA buyer also normally pays the fee to hire an inspector to inspect the home. So the inspector normally goes to the home, like with a fine-tooth comb, to check whether the home meets all the government requirements.
Yeah, is it way more stringent because now you're dealing with Uncle Sam? You're not, you know.
Yes, and also the buyer wants to know, am I buying a home that meets all the government code and requirements? And if there's any issues that are pointed out by the inspector, then it's up to the seller to say, okay, I will fix A, B, C, D, and then you can move forward in the transaction.
Okay, now what happens, Liz, if, you know, because our friends in the military, their duty is very...
Yes.
Obviously very, very tense. Somebody gets emergency deployment, or they have, for whatever reason,
and they're in the middle of the transaction.
Yeah. So, do they sign a lease? Because I mean, typically you know how long you have a duty station.
Well, sometimes if they're called to or they're deployed, what they would probably do is give their spouse a power of attorney to complete the transaction. Now, the power of attorney has to be explicit in terms of what they can and cannot do in terms of the transaction.
Okay, now this sounds like it's a lot of paperwork, and it certainly is. I mean, it's a lot more than you would do on the civilian market, as we said. But the one thing that I know that sellers say is because you're dealing with the federal government, this is guaranteed money you get every single month in full. They pay their bills.
Well, you're talking about there's a purchase, of course, that one takes a while. But if you're talking about rental, of course, again, the home has to meet the requirements because military housing will have to come and inspect the home.
Yeah.
So if they're renting, yes, the government do require certain guidelines. It's got to have a smoke detector in every room. They've got to have a fire extinguisher. All your screens in your window, you have to have the screens in your windows. So there's a number of things, and they do have a list. If any of the audience out there is looking at renting to the military, we do have a list that we could forward to them to show what does the government look for. Now, the other thing they look at is if your shower stall is leaking, that will be a fail. You will not pass inspection. So you really have to go through your home to make sure it meets all the government requirements.
But this is a very valuable and very reliable way of really making money off your property. So thank you very much.
Yes, you're welcome.
And Happy New Year to you and your
Happy New
family.
Year.
And thank you for watching. As always, we're out of time. Bye-bye.
Closed captioning is brought to you by IT&E.